He vanished from headlines while Camilla stepped into history. But Andrew Parker Bowles never truly disappeared. Why did the man once caught in a royal love triangle choose silence for decades? And what memories still haunt him behind that calm, public image? His quiet presence may hold the final key to a royal chapter left unfinished. For over 3 decades, Andrew Parker Bowles remained almost entirely silent about the real reasons his marriage to Camilla ended. Royal observers and the media alike largely assumed that Prince Charles was the catalyst, that his long-standing affair with Camilla had finally forced the end of a once happy union. But now, at the age of 85, Andrew has spoken publicly for the first time, and what he reveals is far more complicated and far more painful than anyone expected. His tone wasn't bitter, nor did he cast blame in the way tabloid readers might expect. Instead, he reflected with the weary calm of a man who had endured much in private while maintaining dignity in public. He said, "People think Charles was the reason. That's too easy. There were things that changed in Camilla, subtle at first, and then impossible to ignore." This rare confession stunned listeners because it recast the entire narrative. It wasn't infidelity that undid the marriage, it was transformation. The woman he once adored became someone else entirely. Andrew first met Camilla in the late 1960s. They were both embedded in the world of British high society. He was dashing, Catholic, and a decorated officer in the military. She was charming, beautiful, and well-connected. Together, they appeared to be the perfect aristocratic couple. Their 1973 wedding was a social highlight, attended by royalty and family with great fanfare. The public saw a glamorous pair. What they didn't see was that even then, emotional complexities were simmering beneath the surface. Over the years, Andrew remained quiet about Camilla's ongoing emotional connection with Prince Charles. The two had been close friends since the early 1970s, and that closeness persisted even after their respective marriages. Andrew was aware of this bond, and for years, he chose not to confront it publicly. But the impact it had on their private life was profound. Andrew once said that he understood the pressures of royal life and the unique dynamic between Camilla and Charles. But what troubled him more deeply was the change he witnessed in Camilla herself. He described it not as a sudden break, but as a slow erosion of intimacy and authenticity. "There were moments," he said, "where I felt I was speaking to a version of her that had been carefully constructed. Not the woman I married, but the woman she needed to be to survive in that world." He spoke of how public life and palace politics began to shape her. Over time, her priorities shifted, her demeanor changed, and her affection grew colder. It wasn't just that she was growing closer to Charles, it was that she was growing further from Andrew. This distance wasn't marked by fights or dramatic arguments. Instead, it was filled with silence, rehearsed smiles at public events, and increasingly separate lives behind closed doors. He said it felt like watching someone gradually walk away from you while still standing in the same room. That sense of emotional abandonment was more painful to him than any external affair or gossip headline. For Andrew, the end of the marriage wasn't about scandal, it was about the loss of connection. He didn't recognize the person Camilla had become, and by the time their divorce was finalized in 1995, he felt more like a supporting actor in her story than her partner in life. His late-life revelation now forces many to reconsider what truly went wrong and who paid the price in silence. What exactly changed in Camilla, and when did Andrew first realize she was slipping away from him emotionally? Let's find out. A picture-perfect start with cracks beneath. In the early years of their relationship, Andrew Parker Bowles and Camilla Shand embodied what many considered the ideal match. They were both attractive, well-bred, and socially elite. Their wedding in 1973 was a grand affair, drawing aristocrats, royals, and influential figures from across Britain. Photographs from the time show a glowing bride and a confident groom, both seemingly poised for a long and prosperous future together. Yet beneath the elegant veneer, their bond was never as stable as it appeared. Camilla had known Prince Charles before she married Andrew, Their connection was not just friendly, it was emotionally significant, though Camilla went forward with her marriage to Andrew regardless. Some family friends noted even then that Camilla never fully let go of her affection for Charles, even while accepting Andrew's proposal. At the time, these quiet observations were whispered among close circles, dismissed as speculative gossip. Andrew, for his part, was widely known as a charismatic figure. He served as an officer in the British Army and was frequently described as dashing and popular, especially among women. His reputation as a ladies' man followed him into his marriage, with numerous rumors of affairs trailing behind him. While Camilla was aware of his flirtatious nature, she seemed to tolerate it in public, but privately, those behaviors began to chip away at the foundation of their relationship. What many didn't realize was that both Andrew and Camilla entered the marriage with unspoken expectations. For Andrew, the union may have seemed like a logical step, consolidating his image and social stature. For Camilla, it may have been an attempt to find emotional stability after the uncertainty of her earlier involvement with Charles. However, neither of them was prepared for how these unresolved emotional ties and differing personalities would slowly cause a quiet unraveling. From the outset, their marriage was punctuated by periods of distance. Though they had 2 children and maintained a shared home, their emotional connection lacked the deep intimacy many assumed was there. Social commitments, military responsibilities, and constant public appearances created an environment where genuine communication became increasingly rare. They became experts at presenting a united front while drifting further apart internally. Family insiders would later suggest that both Camilla and Andrew were deeply private individuals who rarely expressed their vulnerabilities to each other. This emotional reserve may have contributed to misunderstandings and unspoken resentments. Camilla, once full of laughter and mischief, began to turn inward. Andrew, always composed and proper, became even more withdrawn in the face of domestic tensions. As the years progressed, their home life became more performative. Events, dinners, and family milestones were marked by outward grace, but little true warmth. The energy that once defined their early courtship slowly gave way to obligation and routine. Neither one confronted the emotional gap head-on. Instead, both seemed to accept the slow decline, each adapting to a version of marriage that looked strong on the outside but lacked meaningful connection inside. Friends of the couple began to notice. While never discussing the situation openly, their expressions at public events, the lack of physical closeness, and the frequent time spent apart spoke volumes. The smiles they shared for cameras were real, but not necessarily for each other. The tension wasn't explosive, but it lingered, quietly and steadily. As Camilla's emotional ties to Prince Charles deepened, let's tell you how long Andrew could ignore the signs before they became impossible to dismiss. The ghost of Charles and a growing distance. In every marriage, there are invisible forces that either draw people closer or push them apart. For Andrew Parker Bowles and Camilla, one of those forces was a man who was never entirely out of the picture: Prince Charles. While many believed Camilla left Charles behind when she married Andrew in 1973, the emotional bond between her and the future king never truly dissolved. Instead, it simply changed form, going underground, existing in letters, quiet conversations, and a persistent emotional thread that pulled Camilla in ways Andrew could feel but never name aloud. At first, the presence of Charles in their lives was subtle. He would occasionally appear at social gatherings or public events. Camilla's face would light up in a way Andrew noticed but never commented on. He was too proud, too disciplined to express jealousy or suspicion. His military background had taught him composure, and it served him well in public. But privately, small moments began to build. A comment made at dinner, a smile held too long, a letter folded too carefully. Each instance was a small pinprick to the stability of their marriage. Charles and Camilla's friendship became more active during the late 1970s and into the 1980s, even as Charles began his own courtship with Lady Diana Spencer. According to palace insiders, Charles never emotionally detached from Camilla, even after marrying Diana in 1981, and Camilla, for her part, remained a constant presence in his private life. This dynamic, although hidden from the public, was no secret to Andrew. He saw it unfold slowly and silently, like a fog drifting into a room and never quite leaving. Camilla was not a woman who revealed her thoughts easily, but even in her silence, Andrew began to sense a shift. Her responses grew more restrained, her attention often somewhere else. She would occasionally retreat into herself during conversations or lose focus during family dinners. Andrew recognized the signs, not of infidelity in the physical sense, but of emotional distance, of someone preoccupied by another world that excluded him. At this point in their marriage, public perception remained unchanged. To the outside world, Andrew and Camilla were still functioning as a united couple. They attended events together, raised their children with care, and maintained appearances with practiced ease. Yet inside their home, intimacy was no longer a part of their routine. Conversations became shorter, physical affection disappeared, and even shared silence began to feel awkward rather than comfortable. One of the turning points came during the mid-1980s, when phone conversations between Charles and Camilla became more frequent and intense. Though they were cautious, such things leave traces. Andrew would occasionally walk into a room and find Camilla quietly setting the phone down or turning away from a window. These weren't confrontations. There were no shouting matches or accusations. Instead, there was a chilling calm. Two people silently drifting away from each other while pretending they weren't. Then came a time when even the royal family began to notice the subtle imbalance. Charles invited Camilla to functions that seemed unusual for a woman still married to another man. Camilla received letters at times that Andrew found increasingly hard to ignore. Though he never openly intercepted them, he sensed that she was corresponding with Charles in a way that suggested more than old friendship. The atmosphere in the home grew heavy. Even their children noticed the emotional coldness between their parents, although it was never explained to them. What hurt Andrew most was not the affair itself, but the fact that Camilla seemed emotionally absent in a life they had built together. He wasn't merely losing a wife to another man, he was losing her to a version of herself that he no longer understood. A woman once filled with laughter, humor, and spontaneity had become guarded and precise, almost rehearsed. Her smile still appeared in public, but her eyes rarely lingered on him. By the early 1990s, the emotional gap between them had grown too wide to bridge. They still lived under the same roof, still upheld family responsibilities, but the bond was gone. Andrew once described it to a friend as like living with someone who had already left the room a long time ago. What remained was a strange kind of partnership, a social agreement rather than a marriage. And at the center of it was a man who never physically entered their home but had never quite left Camilla's heart. As Camilla evolved into a different woman entirely, how did that transformation impact the man who once thought he knew her best? Camilla's transformation shocks. Andrew Parker Bowles had long known Camilla as a vibrant, instinctive, and emotionally expressive woman. She was someone who laughed freely, hosted with warmth, and made people feel at ease without effort. Early in their relationship, it was this natural ease and lack of pretense that drew him to her. But by the early 1990s, that version of Camilla was slowly fading. What emerged instead was a more guarded, deliberate, and calculating figure, one that Andrew struggled to recognize. This transformation didn't happen overnight. It evolved through years of social positioning and quiet adjustments to her image. Camilla had learned the art of discretion not only for survival, but for strategic advantage. As her connection to Prince Charles intensified and the scrutiny of the press grew, she began reshaping herself to fit into a different world. This world demanded control, patience, and image management, qualities that began to replace spontaneity and emotional openness. To outsiders, this shift may have seemed like maturity or adaptation. But to Andrew, it was something far more personal. He was not merely observing a woman adapting to public life. He was watching his wife become someone whose priorities no longer aligned with their shared history. The home they once built together felt less like a sanctuary and more like a stage. Every action, every word began to feel rehearsed. Even small daily moments, breakfast conversations, quiet evenings, shared glances lost the authenticity that once made their relationship feel intimate. Andrew noticed changes in Camilla's social behavior as well. She became more focused on appearances, more aligned with individuals who understood palace culture and royal expectation. Strategists and public relations professionals became part of her inner circle. She began choosing her company based on influence and discretion rather than emotional connection. This wasn't the woman Andrew had known in their early years. That woman valued humor, comfort, and simplicity. This new version was measured, selective, and constantly mindful of how she was perceived. Camilla also started keeping emotional distance at home. She spoke less, confided less, and eventually became more silent than Andrew could tolerate. Her laughter, once so frequent and genuine, grew sparse. Andrew felt like he was no longer her confidant, but merely a figure occupying the same space. Though they were still legally married, their emotional lives had already moved on to separate paths. What troubled Andrew most was not just that she changed, but that she did so without including him in the process. There was no discussion, no shared reflection about the shifts happening in their lives. He would often walk past her in the hallway and feel like he was passing a stranger. They no longer spoke about their future, nor did they reflect on their past. Even parenting became more transactional, focusing on logistics rather than shared joy. He once admitted to a close friend that the silence between them became more painful than any argument could have been. Arguments imply engagement, passion, or care, but silence, he said, suggests resignation. That's what their marriage had become, a quiet detachment wrapped in routine. He remained polite, fulfilled his responsibilities, and maintained public composure. But inside, he was grappling with the grief of losing someone who was still physically present, yet emotionally distant. The final stage of Camilla's transformation came when she began to prepare herself for the possibility of stepping into royal life more formally. The press was starting to soften toward her. Her relationship with Charles was no longer entirely secret. She was no longer hiding in the background. She was learning how to carry herself with the discipline and etiquette expected of someone close to the monarchy. Andrew, watching from the sidelines, realized with finality that her world had shifted permanently. This realization brought him not anger, but sorrow. He didn't blame Camilla for adapting. He understood the pressure she was under. But he mourned the loss of the woman he once knew, the Camilla who danced freely at parties, who hosted dinner in her robe, who giggled at inside jokes, had been replaced by someone poised, polished, and emotionally unreachable. In that space of loss, Andrew finally understood that he no longer fit into her life, not because of scandal, but because of evolution. As the emotional gap widened into a chasm, how did the final unraveling of their marriage occur? And why did it end in silence rather than conflict? Stay with us to know. The final breakdown: more than betrayal. The end of a marriage rarely arrives with a single event. For Andrew Parker Bowles and Camilla, there was no explosive confrontation or headline-making moment. Instead, their relationship quietly collapsed under the weight of emotional absence. Years of avoidance, unspoken pain, and growing indifference created a distance that words could no longer close. What remained between them was more polite formality than genuine connection. By the time they formally separated in the early 1990s, both had come to terms with the quiet truth. They were no longer partners in any meaningful sense. Their shared life had become a series of routines held together by habit and public expectation. There were no outbursts or dramatic gestures. The foundation had simply eroded. Camilla's presence in the home felt more symbolic than real. She moved with purpose, fulfilling duties, raising their children, appearing in public, but without the warmth or intimacy that once defined their bond. Andrew had long stopped expecting emotional reciprocity. Over the years, he had learned to manage disappointment without showing it. Friends later remarked that he carried himself with dignity even as he lived through the slow unraveling of a marriage that no longer offered him comfort. His restraint masked a deep sadness. He never wanted pity, nor did he seek public sympathy. Yet the pain of being forgotten emotionally, of becoming invisible in the eyes of someone once loved, left a mark on him that only those closest to him could sense. What made this breakdown particularly devastating for Andrew was not betrayal in the conventional sense. It was something more subtle and far more painful. Camilla had stopped including him in her emotional world. She no longer shared her thoughts or looked to him for support. It was as if a wall had been built between them, not made of hostility, but indifference. The absence of connection hurt more than any scandal ever could. There were moments, however, when memories of the past flickered between them. A shared glance at a family event or a brief smile during a quiet dinner would occasionally surface. But these moments only deepened the ache, reminding Andrew of what had been lost. The contrast between their past and present was not only emotional, it was almost physical. They no longer touched in familiar ways. Even sitting near each other felt like a performance for others, not an expression of closeness. Eventually, they no longer pretended. Though they remained under the same roof for a while, their lives were essentially separate. Camilla spent more time away, often with friends, or visiting Charles at events where Andrew was deliberately not present. Their children, now older, began to understand that the warmth once shared between their parents had faded. While the couple remained respectful of each other, there was no longer an attempt to repair what was broken. Andrew did not speak publicly about the emotional collapse until much later in life. At the time, he maintained a silence that many mistook for indifference. In truth, he was processing the end of something he never believed would truly fail. He had entered the marriage with expectations of enduring companionship. That it ended not in anger, but in emotional abandonment was, to him, the cruelest conclusion. Camilla, meanwhile, was stepping more confidently into a different life. Her relationship with Charles had become more accepted within certain royal circles. Public sentiment had begun to shift. She was preparing for a future that no longer included Andrew. Not only in practice, but in identity, she was moving toward a destiny that demanded she leave her past behind, including the man who had once stood beside her at the altar. The divorce in 1995 formalized what had long been understood. It was not a scandal-driven split, nor was it framed as a betrayal by either party. It was described publicly as a mutual decision between two people who had grown apart. Yet those words, simple and diplomatic, barely captured the emotional gravity of what had truly happened. A man had watched the person he loved slowly fade into another life without ever saying goodbye. After the separation, how did Andrew rebuild his life away from royalty? And what did he hold on to when everything familiar had changed? Let's tell you the details of it. Life after Camilla. Peace in the shadows. In the aftermath of his separation from Camilla, Andrew Parker Bowles quietly stepped out of the spotlight. While the media had long portrayed him as a central figure in the triangle involving Prince Charles and Camilla, Andrew made no attempts to hold on to public attention. Their official divorce was finalized in 1995, yet it had become clear that the two had been emotionally distant for some time. Friends and insiders had already confirmed that the marriage had lost its personal intimacy years earlier, even though they continued to present a united front at social events. Rather than cling to the past or engage in public narratives, Andrew chose a life of quiet dignity. In 1996, just a year after his divorce from Camilla, he married Rosemary Pittman. This new chapter brought a sense of peace and companionship that Andrew had longed for. Rosemary, who had also been previously married, was known for her reserved nature and kindness. Together, they avoided social headlines, preferring a private life that stood in stark contrast to the whirlwind public trajectory Camilla was stepping into. While Camilla's public image underwent a dramatic transformation, from being perceived as the third person in Charles and Diana's troubled marriage to eventually becoming queen consort, Andrew remained silent. He did not give interviews, publish memoirs, or make public appearances that could have reshaped his own image. His absence from the narrative made him nearly invisible, yet it also shielded him from the often harsh spotlight that followed the royal family and its closest circle. Those who knew Andrew described him as a man who valued loyalty and discretion above all else. Despite being married to Camilla during the years when her relationship with Charles evolved behind the scenes, he never publicly criticized her. Some speculate that Andrew's acceptance of the situation was not passive, but rather rooted in a practical understanding of the royal institution and its complexities. After all, he had served in the British Army with distinction and was familiar with duty, sacrifice, and the weight of public roles. Even as Camilla married Charles in 2005 and her profile within the monarchy grew, Andrew continued to avoid being pulled back into the story. When Queen Elizabeth eventually gave her blessing for Camilla to become queen consort, the nation turned its attention once again to Camilla's journey. Yet Andrew remained quietly supportive from a distance, never expressing resentment or bitterness over her elevated role. His silence spoke louder than any interview might have. Tragically, in 2010, Rosemary passed away after a battle with cancer. Her death was a significant loss for Andrew, who had found emotional stability and love in their relationship. Those close to him observed that he grieved deeply, but once again, he did so privately. He did not seek public sympathy, nor did he allow grief to make him a subject of renewed tabloid interest. Instead, he continued living a life defined by routine, reflection, and the quiet satisfaction of having stepped away from the chaos. What remained most compelling about Andrew's post-Camilla life was not just the silence, but what that silence may have concealed. While the world focused on Camilla's transformation, few stopped to consider what Andrew had held on to in his memories. Was there nostalgia for the years before the monarchy pulled her away? Did he carry regret, or simply a quiet understanding of how their story had unfolded? Former acquaintances have suggested that despite everything, Andrew retained a measure of affection for Camilla. Their bond, built on shared history, children, and decades of friendship, likely endured in some unspoken form. Though no longer a couple, they were tied by their son Tom and daughter Laura, and by the experiences that only they could fully understand. The fact that Andrew never exploited these experiences for attention is perhaps the greatest testament to his character. Today, Andrew Parker Bowles stands as a symbol of quiet resilience. He witnessed one of the most controversial royal relationships unfold from a uniquely personal position, yet never made himself a central figure in the story. His life after Camilla was not marked by scandal or bitterness, but rather by a return to privacy, grounded relationships, and a quiet strength. His journey invites reflection on the cost of proximity to royalty. While some chase the spotlight, others walk away. And in Andrew's case, peace was not found in public redemption, but in private contentment. He may have faded from the headlines, but the part of the story he chose to live speaks volumes. Now let's talk about what part of Camilla and their past did Andrew hold on to as memory. The real story behind the crown. Now in his 80s, Andrew is no longer surrounded by royal advisors, journalists, or the noise of public opinion. He has entered a reflective period where truth holds more weight than image. And it is in this phase that he offers an unexpected perspective on the monarchy, not from bitterness or rivalry, but from long-lived experience. His relationship with Camilla, though long dissolved, remains an important chapter in his life. They shared years together as young parents, navigated aristocratic expectations, and weathered personal sacrifices. The passing of time has not erased those memories. Despite Camilla's new title and elevated position, Andrew has shown grace and even support, attending her coronation as queen consort without fanfare. He remains part of the extended family, though not by title or function, but by shared history. Andrew's quiet dignity may well be his greatest legacy. Rather than write tell-all memoirs or stoke public drama, he chose the harder path of stepping aside. That choice has allowed him to preserve relationships, including with his children, who now find themselves straddling two powerful narratives: their mother's ascension to royalty and their father's quiet removal from the limelight. His late second wife, Rosemary Pittman, brought him peace and companionship for many years until her passing. It was with her that he found solace away from royal gossip. After her death, he retreated even further into a life defined not by headlines, but by simplicity. As Camilla's public legacy grows, Andrew's story invites a deeper question. How do we measure worth in a world so obsessed with visibility? Perhaps his life reminds us that presence is not always louder than absence. The real measure of influence might just lie in the ability to let go without resentment. What are your thoughts on Andrew Parker Bowles' quiet journey through love, royalty, and legacy? Share your reflections in the comments, and don't forget to check out the next story that reveals another side of royal history.